if the recording could. First off, my condolences to the Mu'mineen on the Ayyam of Fatimiyya, and inshallah, may Allah allow us to be believers and those who follow in the footsteps of the Ahlul Bayt and use these moments in history, um, such as Ayyam Fatimiyya, as a means of uplifting ourselves towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and developing a very strong connection and paying attention to our connection with the Ahlul Bayt, especially Sayyidah Fatima salam. Having said that, today's first section will be about the idea of um, culminating, really bringing to close, really the understanding we have of ourselves. So we talked about the idea that we actually have a nafs, and we talked about different explanations of that nafs in the beginning of the module. And our attempt was that by explaining that we have this nafs and the fact that the criterion for our success now goes back to this nafs. Now, we went further and said that actually the criterion for the actions, criterion for success went back to this nafs. Not only that, our ahkam are also ones that are there to try and facilitate perfection in this nafs. We want to, so the link between this idea of having a purified nafs and having maintaining the balance in the faculties, this way of understanding both ourselves and then our actions and then the world around us, inshallah, helps create that worldview for us regarding how we perceive both not only ourselves, right, but rather our interactions and our actions that occur within our daily lives. With the points that Sheikh Mahdi started to teach a few sessions from now, we recognize that becoming a muwahhid, becoming somebody who is bringing into submission his nafs before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by means of his intellect, submitting the desire and the waham and the shahwa and the ghadab, right? This person who is now becoming somebody who is doing taslim, who is now submitting his will and his faculties to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the outcome of this is not that hardships will not occur in our life. The apparent hardships, it's not the case that they will not occur, and we saw examples of that, for example, in the life of the Holy Prophet. So, apparent issues and apparent difficulties are not what we're after in terms of decreasing. Rather, we're after the mode by which we traverse when these difficulties occur. So these are preliminary points that we must understand before entering into the next point, which is that just as how we viewed the difficulties and we tried to manage our difficulties such that we were observing a balance between our anger and our shahwa, our anger and our desire faculty by means of our aql, so too must we recognize that the time in which we have to achieve proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and allow for this submitting to take place is our 24 hours. So in this case, we have a responsibility to look at this 24 hours of ours in a very special manner. Okay. But there's some qualities regarding the 24 hours which we must understand. If I give you a $5 bill and I say, can you guys go please buy some candy with it, let's say. Okay. A $5 bill that's crumpled up and a $5 bill that's perfectly flat and straight, in terms of value, they both are the same. Okay. But the hours of our 24 hours, our daily life, are not like that. The energy value significantly dictates how that particular hour can be spent. For example, here it's around 5:43 a.m., right? If I schedule some high energy intense things in this particular time, while people are just typically waking up, chances are this is the wrong time to use for that particular type of activity. Or in another case, if I was, let's say, 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and I decided that I wanted to use that time to go on social media and screen and basically introduce blue light to my eyes, that'll be the wrong time to have that particular action take place. Okay. Why? Because it'll prevent me from doing what's coming up next. So sometimes the allocation of action and activity to the time slot is needs to be considered in terms of the activity itself vis-a-vis the energy that's spent during said activity. Or sometimes it's the fact that the repercussion of that activity on the items that follow from that particular time. So in the case of the sleep, for example, if I introduce myself to blue light from screens at the time before I have to go to sleep, then by the time I have to go to sleep, it will have significantly disturbed my capacity to do so. Okay. So a side point here, when we're talking about this idea now of managing our 24 hours and ensuring that our 24 hours has certain aspects to them, it might sound like a very similar talk that somebody who's very pragmatic and very driven by the dunya might be having. That, hey, you have to account time as money and so on and so forth. Hopefully by now you recognize that the conclusion and the basis for this now, us managing our 24 hours, is not that time is money. Rather, time now is the very resource we have that we can use to now submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's much more important than money. A waste of time is something that is drastically contra to an Islamic worldview. And the management of time is a religious responsibility now for those who want to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are certain aspects in my 24 hours which are critical and innately important for me to include them in that 24-hour planning. My intellect comes in and identifies that I have a physical body. I have now also a ruh. I also have these different titles on me, like I'm a Baba, I'm a Talebe, and so on and so forth. Okay. So with each of these realms of my existences come certain responsibilities on my shoulder. So my physical realm brings for me the idea that I absolutely need to manage my sleep, my exercise, and my diet. So managing these things now isn't just something that we're doing because it's good to do. Rather, it now takes on with this intention a religious color to it. So the management itself now, if it's done for the sake of allowing this physical body to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to provide this physical body with the means to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that very management now becomes an ibadah. Okay? So the paradigm shift from a very modern capitalistic way of looking at time and saying time is money is not what we're after. Rather, something much more deeper exists. The usage of our intellect to maneuver through the management of the 24 hours and ensuring that neither our shahwa nor our ghadab takes hold of this 24 hours. And what do we mean by that? Let me give you an example. Certain actions are things that we like to do. Like let's say go to YouTube or play a certain sport and so on and so forth. Certain actions we have a tendency to want to perform more of, right? So preventing our nafs from indulging in those actions while they might cause a neglect in other responsibilities that we have, other areas of responsibilities that we have on our shoulders, is extremely important to manage that. So here now, the management and the control of the intellect over the other two faculties is displayed in this manner. Right? In a very similar manner, our anger faculty also displays here. Anger faculty is typically misunderstood to mean that it's a faculty which has to do with harshness and upsetness and so on and so forth. Rather, it's simply the faculty which pushes away that which we don't want. So oftentimes, if we find that there are certain responsibilities that we have on our shoulders, right? And we procrastinate them and we push them forward, right? And we don't act on that. In fact, the deficiency there might be linked to the imbalance in the faculty of anger. So the nafs now, right, uses the balancer, the intellect, to come now and prevent desire from taking over the 24 hours and filling it with things only on the criterion of what it likes to do. Okay. And it also comes and controls now the anger faculty, right? In preventing actions which that person wants to remove from themselves because they don't have an inclination towards working. I word this very specifically so you can understand and appreciate that there is this connection between the two. The faculty of desire and the faculty of anger work hand in hand to try and topple the faculty of intellect. And it's the job of the faculty of the intellect now to come and balance these two faculties in the 24 hours. Okay. So when we're performing our actions, when we're performing our management of the 24 hours, including making sure that we have included the right amount of sleep in it, making sure that we've included the right amount of exercise in it, and not only the right amount, but rather the right placement as well, right? I hinted at the beginning of this particular section. So once I am doing this, if I'm attentive towards the fact that I'm doing it for submission, then this becomes an ibadah, as I mentioned, correct? There are certain things that I absolutely need for myself at the physical realm. I mentioned those, but there's other realms associated with me too now. So as I said, there's a title on me that says Baba. We have a social realm associated with us too, a realm that links to other than our person. This includes friends, this includes society, but most importantly, it includes our family. We have in Islam very global teachings, like for example, the heart of a believer having a certain value, right? Oftentimes, we don't recognize that this particular explanation regarding the heart of the believer applies to our spouses and our kids as well, right? Inshallah, we're in a family where our spouse and our kids are believers. They're Muslims. They're ones who are trying to follow the deen. So now, when we were dealing with them and making sure that we allocate time in terms of both quality and placement of said time, such that I can maintain the needs of my family. So my kids need a baba who's energetic enough to run after them and chase after them and play with them at the age that they're at, right? My spouse needs a husband who can focus and understand on what she's saying and communicate with her without being distracted by her phone, by his phone, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the management that me now as a Baba, comes and does of his 24 hours is critical that both the placement of time is such that it allows me to fulfill those responsibilities and the quality and quantity of that time is sufficient as well. A third level that we must incorporate within our being is the idea that because we have a nafs, our nafs also needs to increase. And here we come into the point of increasing our nafs by means of apparent worship. So far, everything we talked about was worship because it was done for the sake of submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But certain acts of worship are specific, such that they're not forms that you're choosing, rather they're forms that Allah has chosen. So these forms of submission that Allah has chosen, because He's chosen them, gain special value. So we call them khas worship. Okay. These include the recitation of the Holy Quran. These include the recitation of small du'as in the day. These include the remembrance of how the median between the divine and mankind exists and why the deen really is only possible that it reached us was because of the Holy Prophet and his family. So the remembrance and the connection to the Holy Prophet and his family. So these things, like these small ziyarat, these small du'as, recitation of the Holy Quran, right? Most as mustahab acts. And then we have the wajib acts, like the daily prayers and so on and so forth. These make up the spiritual entity of my person. Okay. Allocation of time for these in terms of quantity and quality is extremely pivotal and important too. What do these actions do? What's the purpose of these actions? See, sleep was required that if I didn't sleep properly, then I wasn't able to actually use my day appropriately and have the right amount of energy to submit in that day. That was the purpose of sleep, right? It rejuvenated me. It gave me energy that I required and needed for myself to continue and and basically do the actions of that particular day, play with my kids where needed, spend time with my spouse where needed. If you take sleep out of the picture, then doing these things became very difficult. So now, what is the purpose and the one of the purposes and the quality which uh, spiritual actions such as these ibadat which are khas that Allah has appointed now. What purpose do these fill for us in our 24 hours? So in the worldview that we have developed regarding our nafs being the real self, our nafs being the essence of our existence, now these actions, these khas actions, these actions that deal with worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they turn a puddle into an ocean. Let me explain that now. See, when you have a puddle and you drop rocks of hardship in that puddle, right? The surface of that goes up and down and water splashes everywhere and so on and so forth. Okay. So the puddle, the reaction it shows to the hardships of rocks coming and hitting it, right, is severe. But if you were to drop these rocks of hardships in an ocean now, right, the entirety of the ocean doesn't go up and down and topple and cause a lot of ruckus in it. It remains rather calm. It takes that hardship in and sinks it to the bottom if it's a rock, for example. Spirituality allows for the nafs, it grants the nafs the capacity to deal with hardships. At the moments of hardships, when difficulties arrive, it allows the capacity for the intellect to maintain its control now over the desire and the anger and the wahm. We see that in the stories that are presented by Sheikh Mahdi so far in the historical accounts. where time and time again, massive difficulties would be faced by the Holy Prophet. Immense difficulties would be faced by Sayyidah Fatima, as we're in Fatimiyya right now, right? But these did not allow for them to lose that control over their 24 hours. It did not allow for them to let go of their responsibilities in the 24 hours. So when we come to now manage our 24 hours, it's not a management which is spurred on by this idea of time equals money. Rather, it's spurred on and it's motivated by this idea that my time is the resource I have for submission. My time equals submission. My time has the capacity to equal submission. Okay. So I plan now my 24 hours based on that to see where is it now that I must submit and how is it now that I must submit. In this way of thinking, in this worldview, going to sleep on the right time now becomes a religious obligation. Taking their kids to the park now becomes a religious obligation. Spending time with your spouse and putting down the phone now becomes a religious obligation. Man recognizes that, in fact, throughout the 24 hours, he is not alone. Rather, he finds himself in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as such, he manages both the quality and the quantity of his actions throughout his 24 hours to meet the various responsibilities that he has on his shoulders. So, this understanding of our nafs and the understanding of purpose behind actions and the understanding of success coming from this person, success is for the person who does tazkiyah, who purifies his nafs, right? We get an understanding now that this purification, one area of this purification, which is um, pivotal really in the development of the nafs, is the management of the 24 hours. It's the controlling of the aql, is allowing our aql to control the 24 hours and preventing our shahwa or our ghadab from taking over the 24 hours. And in this regard, we have a hadith from the Ahl Bayt. One such a hadith points to the fact that divide your time, divide your day into various chunks. I'm paraphrasing the hadith for you. One chunk of that, let that be your halal pleasure. Why? Because with the energy you gain from your halal pleasure, you'll be able to do the rest of the tasks as well. But the Ahl Bayt have given us explicit instructions here too. In the management of the 24 hours, we don't mean that at all times sit on the prayer mat only and do nothing but that or just do responsibilities. Rather, it says that one of your responsibilities is to take care of your entertainment as well. Your nafs requires that. So plan for yourself now a time for halal entertainment to gain halal pleasure. And in this time that you've associated for this halal pleasure, whilst you're partaking in that, you're in fact doing what? Ibadah. You're submitting now your will and your 24 hours to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you're saying that my body requires this, and for the need that I have to fulfill, lillah, I am now going to participate in the sport or watch this thing with my family or go for a stroll and so on and so forth. With hopes that those actions now give us the motivation and the energy that we need really to perform the rest of the actions that we have. This concludes the session today on understanding ourselves. Inshallah, I'll hand over the talk to Sheikh Mahdi. Please recite salawat. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. I hope you dear brothers and sisters are keeping well. I just want to make sure my voice is okay. If you have any questions or comments before we start, please you can say it, take the mic up and say it or message on the chat. Otherwise, inshallah, we will get started. So I didn't see any responses. Everything okay? My voice is coming through okay, inshallah? Okay. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I hope you can see the screen as well now. I put the slides on, inshallah, although there's not too much on the slides this time, but inshallah it will help a little bit. Okay, so what we want to keep doing today is to continue with our discussion on the seerah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Prior to that, though, I had promised there was one discussion that came up last week when we had mentioned Bibi Fatima as part of the kind of events that transpired in the Meccan period of the Prophet's life. We mentioned the birth of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. And then I said that since these are the days of Fatimiyya, I wanted to open up one discussion very quickly, which is this idea of, might come to our minds in these days, that why was it that Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam did not do more to defend his wife? God forbid, is it like, how can we understand this? That on the one hand, we see that Bibi Fatima alayhi salam does so much in this time period, the short time period after the demise of the Prophet, before her shahadat. She goes to the mosque, she gives that very eloquent khutbah, she talks to the ladies of the Muhajirin and the Ansar who come to visit her. She takes a very strong stance to wake up the Muslim Ummah, but on the other hand, we don't see Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam doing much. And so perhaps this thought may be in our mind that why did not Imam Ali alayhi salam do more? If they're both ma'asum, shouldn't they both take the same course of action exactly? I was wondering if anybody has any thoughts, any comments on this before I share a few comments myself. Why do you think that might be the case? One person is saying their roles are different, hence they took different actions. Ahsant, in a sense, that is basically the gist of it. That, look, to kind of summarize the reason why is that both Bibi Fatima alayhi salam and Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, they had a certain responsibility before Allah that they were expected to fulfill. With their own intellect, they knew this. With the advice that the Prophet had given Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he knew what he had to do. And so for a wali of Allah, for any believer who is high in their proximity to Allah, their only goal, their only happiness lies in obeying Allah. No matter how difficult that is. For Amir al-Mu'mineen, we cannot even imagine how difficult it must have been to see the dhulm that happened to Bibi Fatima, to lose Bibi Fatima. It wasn't just an emotional love that a husband and wife would normally have. No, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam recognized and saw the perfection of Allah's characteristics in his wife. She was that perfect, mirror of all kamal, all perfection. And so it was very difficult for him to see that, but basically both of them knew that they had a certain responsibility. The Holy Prophet had told Amir al-Mu'mineen that he has to be patient in this time, that the munafiqun, the hypocrites, were waiting for him to take a stance so that they could cause a civil war within the Muslim Ummah and uproot Islam. And so even though it was so difficult, he had to see the dhulm happening to his wife, the martyrdom of his child who had not yet been born, he had that responsibility of staying quiet. Whereas no, Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, her responsibility was one where she had to somehow do itmam hujjat and show the Muslim ummah, show the history forever that there was this great injustice that happened. And by her stance that she took, by the fact that her grave is hidden, this has forever remained as a very important kind of message, lesson point that was conveyed. Just one or two hadith I thought I would mention in this regard. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam in khutbah shiqiyya, the third khutbah of Nahj al-Balagha, he somehow eloquently in his beautiful Arabic, he illustrates how difficult this period was. He says, فَصَبَرْتُ وَفِي الْعَيْنِ قَضَى وَفِي الْحَلْقِ شَجَى, that I had to bear patiently while it was as if there was a thorn in my eye and there was a bone stuck in my throat. That's the level of difficulty I had to go through. Or we see that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, at certain times, he did not just remain patient. There were certain times where his patience was like, he kind of showed his strength, and he put certain limits on these enemies of Allah. And so, for example, there's one account, two accounts in Biharul Anwar, I'll read to you. One of them, after the burial of Bibi Fatima, salamullahi alayha, the second caliph came, and he basically he said that, I swear by Allah, we will take out, we will like do nabsh qabr, we will take the grave, the body, the blessed body of Bibi Fatima out so that we can pray namaz mayyat over her. At that time, Amir al-Mu'mineen, he grabs him by his collar and he says, Yabna Sauda, amma haqqi faqad taraktuhu makhafata an yartadda an-nasu an dinihim. He said, Oh, Ibn Sauda, referring to the second caliph, that I left aside my right out of fear that the people would leave religion. وَأَمَّا قَبْرُ فَاطِمَةَ فَوَالَّذِي نَفْسُ عَلِيَّ بِيَدِهِ لَإِنْ رُمْتَ وَأَصْحَابُكَ شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ لَأَسْقِيَنَّ الْأَرْضَ مِنْ دِمَائِكُمْ. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, look, I left aside my right. I didn't fight for the khilafat because that was what I had to do for the sake of Allah. But if you dare try to go towards the grave of Fatima to take her out, I will quench the earth around us with your blood. لَأَسْقِيَنَّ الْأَرْضَ مِنْ دِمَائِكُمْ. So obviously, and there was another hadith I thought I would read, but basically the idea is clear that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam was not scared. He was not somebody who was weak. If he wanted to, he could have taken action and he could have done a lot. But he knew that it was his responsibility before Allah. And true strength lies in that. True strength is not in how strong your muscles are or how good you can hit a sword. True strength lies in how good you can be a servant of Allah. And a lot of these points that we have been discussing, inshallah, in these sessions, to do with controlling our anger, controlling our desire, allowing our intellect to be in charge of us, these are indicative of somebody who is truly strong. It was basically this idea. I can give you the reference in Biharul Anwar. Brother Kumail has asked a question. I can give you the reference from Biharul Anwar later on. But basically, the idea was that he was saying that he was upset that he didn't get to pray Salatul Mayyit, Namaz Mayyit on the blessed body of Bibi Fatima. So he basically said that we will take her out of the grave. We will, in Farsi or Arabic, we would say Nabsh Qabr. We do Nabsh Qabr, take her out, which is something haram. Unless in certain circumstances, in fiqh of Islam, you're not allowed to do that. Take her out, pray namaz mayyat, and then bury her. And that was when Amir al-Mu'mineen was very harsh. Okay, with that, if there's no questions or comments, let's continue with our discussion of talking about the seerah. Basically, we should really value this opportunity we have, and again, just kind of remind ourselves, what are we doing this for? In terms of valuing this opportunity, I thought I would mention one or two ahadith about the status of the Holy Prophet. In some ahadith, we have ma bara Allahu bariyatan, or in other ahadith, nasamatan khayran min Muhammad. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The best of all creation, Allah has not created anybody better than the Holy Prophet. In one hadith, Amir al-Mu'mineen is talking to a Jewish rabbi, and when he gives these amazing ma'arif of tawheed and lofty description of Allah, the Jewish rabbi is taken aback and he asks Amir al-Mu'mineen, are you a prophet of Allah? And Amir al-Mu'mineen says, وَيْلَكَ إِنَّمَا أَنَا عَبْدٌ مِّنْ عَبِيدِ Muhammad. No, you should, like, woe upon you. I am nothing but a slave from the slaves of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I just wanted to start off with this point that, alhamdulillah, we have this opportunity in these weeks to kind of remind ourselves of the seerah of the Prophet, the greatest person to ever be created by Allah, the best of all role models, the best uswatun hasana in the words of the Quran. So inshallah, we take advantage of this opportunity. As we're trying to do, we're trying to give in these weeks, 2 weeks have passed, and this week and one more week remains, inshallah. This is the second last session. We want to give both a quick overview of the chronological timeline of events. And then, since you, dear brothers and sisters, are probably familiar with that, we want to also spend a good amount of time taking lessons that apply to the overall purpose of this course, that was shaping an Islamic worldview. And we want to really take out deep lessons that will help us in that regard of shaping a worldview. As we had mentioned, the worldview that we're after is the Islamic worldview that was given to the Ummah by the Holy Prophet. The tradition and the Quran, the Ahadith, the Seerah play a very important role in molding that worldview. A lot of what we discussed in the first few sessions with Sayyid Kamil and Brother Mujahid, those were more an intellectual approach to understanding Islamic discussions of the soul, faculties of the souls and the soul, and why do we need the Sharia. It was a very intellectual approach, almost philosophical approach. But we also want to benefit from the tradition of Islam. And in fact, one of the profound realities that awliya of Allah emphasize is that there's no difference between the intellect and the tradition. Both the intellect and the tradition are two different tools of uncovering reality. When I say there's no difference, I mean that this point, that there are two different tools of attaining the reality. Obviously, there is a difference between them, but we need to take advantage of both of them. Okay, so I'll quickly recap some of the events that we talked about in the seerah of the Prophet and move on to some of the events that transpired during and after the Hijrah. Today we'll kind of go up to the year 5 after Hijrah and briefly mention some of the events. But again, just to remind ourselves, two of the lessons that we took out in the last two sessions were the approach that the Muslims were given and the approach that the Muslims and the Prophet manifested when it came to dealing with difficulty. That was a very important lesson that we looked at in detail, and that really affects our own day-to-day lives. That how do we, as a Muslim, as somebody who has a Tawheedi worldview, an Islamic worldview, how do we approach difficulty in life? We talked about that, so I won't repeat it. Another point that we talked about last week when we mentioned the Prophets, the migration that the Muslims did based on the advice of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a group of Muslims migrated to Abyssinia. I'd even sent a clip from the 1976 movie called The Message to kind of remind ourselves of that story. But the very beautiful point that we tried to take out of that was this idea that even the Prophet was making a plan, a logical, intellectual, apparent, normal plan of how to deal with difficulties in life. Somehow this is related to what Sayyid Kamil just mentioned about taking advantage of our time. The common point being that planning and putting aside time, thinking about what we're doing, how we're spending our time, where we're going, taking advice of experts, counsel. These are all appropriate, logical. Anybody with an intellect, anybody who wants to succeed in life would take this course of action. Of course, we as believers, we couple that and we do that in the bigger picture of tawakkul on Allah, doing dua to Allah, asking God for help, obeying Allah. But we need to do both. We need to follow both the apparent, logical, rational course of action as well as kind of the spiritual, if we can say, course of action. So that was the second lesson we had taken last week. Today, if we would get time, we want to look at two other lessons from the Sirah, which are to do with some of the outstanding, attractive, beautiful characteristics akhlaqi traits of the Holy Prophet. And then this specifically, we want to focus on this idea of how the Prophet really strived to inculcate a culture of brotherhood, sisterhood. The idea being that the Muslims are one ummah, that the Prophet was building this one unit and one community that was very deeply connected to one another. And so even that has a huge impact on our worldview and on our priorities in our life, no matter where we are living, no matter what time we're living in. As these are lessons to kind of take home. There's no questions or comments. What I want to do now quickly is kind of go through the sayr of the chronological timeline of events, very briefly looking at what we already covered and then adding some more points to do with some of the events that we didn't really talk about yet. I'll just pause for a second. If anybody has any questions or comments, please do feel free to jump in. Okay, doesn't look like anybody has anything, so I'm going to continue. Basically, the Prophet ﷺ was born in the year 570 AD, the Gregorian calendar, and he passed away 63 years later, at the age of 63, so about 633 AD was when he passed away. Very quickly, he was born in Mecca. His father had passed away before he was born. For a few years, he was under the care of Halima, and then his mother. Halima was that nurse who took care of him in the desert. His mother, until about the age of 6, when his mother passed away, was looking after him. Then for another couple of years, he was under the care of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. When Abdul Muttalib passed away, Prophet was about 8 years old. Thereafter, he was under the care of Abu Talib. Abu Talib, the father of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. As a young person, he exhibited many outstanding qualities. He was somebody of justice. He did somebody with a lot of skills, a lot of honesty. And one of the events we talked about was that trip that Abu Talib, as a child, when he was a child, Abu Talib took him to Syria. And there was that event where he met that Christian monk, Bahira. Later on, at an older age, he worked for this wealthy lady in Makkah called Bibi Khadija alayha salam. And after that successful business trip, he then married her. We talked about different opinions that people have about the age of Bibi Khadija and whether she had been married before, whether she had children before. Then there was the incident of the Mab'ath, the beginning, the onset of revelation. In the cave Hira, the Prophet was meditating, was worshipping Allah Ta'ala when Angel Jibreel came to him with these verses of Surah Al-Alaq. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. He went home, again, more verses of the Quran were revealed upon him. For 3 years, he privately preached Islam. He was not openly proclaiming Islam for the first 3 years. According to some accounts, in those 3 years, only Bibi Khadija and Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam were the only Muslims. The time came when the Prophet was told to announce Islam to his family. There was that famous incident that we didn't really talk about, but I'm sure you've heard it from the minbar time and again, of Da'watul Dhul Ashira, when the Prophet called his family and Amir al-Mu'mineen, this young child or young teenager, was the only one to respond positively to the call of the Prophet. Then the Prophet is told to proclaim Islam to the public, and he goes up on the mountain of Safa and he announces to the people of Makkah that he is the Prophet of Allah. With this message of Islam openly being propagated and the concept of Tawheed being, emphasized by the Muslims, attacking the idols and the system of idolatry that was prevalent, and with the social political repercussions that came with, then a very, very harsh response started to come from the kuffar of Makkah, from the Quraysh. And so the Muslims were heavily persecuted. They were being killed and tortured. Ammar, Yasir, Sumayya, these were the first shuhada of Islam. In that very difficult situation, in that tribal society where people who didn't have the protection of their tribe were going to be really, really tortured by the kuffar, and those who had the protection of the tribe could be tortured and killed by their own tribe. Okay, in that system, the Prophet worried about the safety of his ummah, he advised a number of them to migrate to Abyssinia, and that episode happened. When the Muslims are welcomed and given security by the king of Abyssinia, the kuffar of Quraysh are further enraged. They want to kill the Prophet, but Abu Talib is never going to allow them to kill the Prophet. So at this point, they begin a 3-year harsh boycott. They economically and socially boycott the Banu Hashim, the Muslims basically. And the Banu Hashim, the Muslims, they take refuge in the valley of Abu Talib. Like with this very brief overview, we can see the service that Abu Talib did to Islam. Again and again, he was protecting the life of the Prophet. He was the one who gave refuge to the Muslims, saved the life of the Prophet. In this time in the valley of Abu Talib, he would tell Imam Ali alayhi salam to sleep in the bed of the Prophet and protect the Prophet's life in that way. Eventually, there's so much strength on the part of the Muslims that the kuffar, the Quraysh, give up. Some of them feel bad that why are we doing this? And they're upset. They want to tear up this boycott agreement. At the same time, a miracle happens and Allah sends these insects to go and eat that agreement that the kuffar had written. They had written an agreement that nobody will trade with the Banu Hashim, nobody will marry in the family of the Banu Hashim. And they had put that in the Kaaba. And Allah by miracle sent these insects to go and eat up that whole agreement. And so with this miracle and with the fact that many of the kuffar were fed up and ready to break the agreement anyways, the boycott comes to an end. But just as the boycott comes to an end, that same year, the year of Huzn, both Abu Talib, the main supporter, and Bibi Khadija, one of the other, of course, huge figures in the life of the Prophet, huge supporter of the Prophet, both of them pass away. Okay, that was about how much we had done so far. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what happened after that. We won't talk about Mi'raj, but what we will talk about a little bit is how the migration happened, how the people of Yathrib came, and some of the initial kind of wars that happened. Again, I will emphasize that if anybody has any questions, any comments, please feel free to interact. I would be happy, inshallah, to hear from you guys. Okay, so in the year 621 AD, so this is just 1 year before the Hijrah, during the Hajj time, the Prophet meets a group of people from Medina. Medina was called Yathrib at that time. He meets about 12 of them. Some of them had already become Muslim the previous year in Hajj. Okay, and anyways, the Prophet makes a pact with these 12 people from Yathrib at the Hajj time, and he makes a pact, an agreement with them. They promise that they're gonna worship one God and not commit certain sins, and he promises paradise for them if they adhere to that. And then also in response to their request, he sends a companion of his to go to Yathrib and to teach people about Islam. There was a person called Mus'ab. A companion called Mus'ab is sent by the Prophet as a muballigh of the deen of Allah, somebody to read Quran, to teach the people of Medina about Islam. Many people in that 1 year, Mus'ab's work is very successful and many people accept Islam in Medina. The next year, a much larger delegation comes to the Hajj, and the Prophet this time makes an agreement, a different kind of agreement. This is called the second treaty of Aqaba. The place where these agreements were made, both in the first year and the second year, was somewhere in Mina. At the end of the Hajj period, the Hujjaj are in Mina for like 2 days, 3 days. There was a place in Mina called Aqaba. And so there the Prophet makes this agreement with the people of Yathrib. The second year, the agreement is heavy. With the uncle of the Prophet, Abbas, it's an agreement that basically the people of Medina are going to fight for the Prophet, are going to protect the Prophet no matter what. If the Prophet takes refuge in their city, they are going to be ready to fight to defend him and treat him like one of their own. And so with that, then the Prophet now is ready to migrate to Medina. He sees that the people of Yathrib are welcoming him. They want him to come there. They're promising that they will defend him. On the other hand, the situation in Makkah has become very precarious, very dangerous with the death of Abu Talib and Bibi Khadija. And so basically in small groups, the Muslims migrate. They are told to leave and they leave to the city of Medina. At this time, when the kuffar of Quraysh, Makkah, they hear about this, they make a plan to kill the Prophet in Dar al-Nadwa, this place where they used to get together, the Sanadid, the chieftains of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan and Abu Lahab and these people. They get together and they make a plan to kill the Prophet. But that same night that they're going to execute that plan, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam sleeps in the bed of the Holy Prophet, and the Prophet is told to leave Makkah. The Prophet leaves Makkah with Abu Bakr, with the first caliph, and they make their way to Medina. I think you guys are generally familiar with the story. Miracles happen. They take refuge in a cave they go in another direction to kind of throw off the Quraysh who must be looking for them. And in that other direction, still there are people who are looking for them. Abu Sufyan has promised, the Quraysh in Makkah have promised that whoever finds the Prophet and brings him back will be given a huge reward. So people are actively looking for the Prophet. But by a miracle of Allah, the Prophet is protected. He takes refuge in a cave, and a spider builds a web right away, and some birds build a nest right away. So when those scouts come looking, they say, there's no way that anybody can be here. Look, there's a web, there's birds. And in that way, the life of the Prophet is saved. Anyways, what I want to focus on a little bit today, I'll come back to some lessons that pertain to this period, that when the Prophet reached Medina, he did certain steps. He took certain political, social steps to kind of establish this new society that he was building in Medina, as opposed to all of the culture that the Arabs had been used to, as opposed to the history where the Arabs lived in a very tribal system. The Prophet wanted to establish a Islamic government, a country, a state in Medina where people were no longer just united based on tribe. They were united based on their belief in God. And so the Prophet did certain things. For example, he built a mosque. For example, he caused this brotherhood amongst the believers. And for example, there was a constitution. There were certain kind of agreements that were made between the Muslims and the other non-Muslims living in the city of Yathrib. Particularly, the main community that remained in those early years were the Jews. There were 3 communities of Jews that I've put their names on this slide. And one by one, they all betrayed the Prophet, and there were kind of fights that happened. 2 of them were exiled, if not 3 of them were exiled from the city. They were called the Bani Qaynuqa', the Bani Nadir, and the Bani Qurayza. Anyways, these were some steps that we'll come back to that the Prophet took, building a mosque, causing brotherhood amongst the believers, and making a constitution. But again, very briefly, we want to kind of continue with the chronology or chronological timeline of events up until, inshallah, today we want to talk about up until the Battle of Khandaq and what transpired after the Battle of Khandaq in the 5th year AH. So basically, the first year AH is when the Hijrah happened. The Muslims, towards the beginning of that year, they migrated to Medina, and like I said, some of the first things that happened were the Prophet built a mosque, and the community began to be established. Right away, there were differences from the community of believers that had been there in Mecca. On the one hand, there were tribal differences, whereas the Muslims of Makkah were generally from the Quraysh. Here we had people who were of different tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj, with hostilities that went back for decades, for maybe centuries. They were fighting amongst one another. Another big difference was that all of a sudden there was this phenomenon of hypocrisy that came about. In Mecca, nobody would ever have dreamed of being a hypocrite. The Muslims were under so much persecution. It was so difficult to be a Muslim that the only people who would be Muslim were those who really were strong in their faith. All of a sudden in Medina, Islam is powerful. Islam is in charge of society. As the years go on, Islam is becoming stronger and stronger, richer and richer. And so there is more and more of an impetus for people to pretend to believe. It is in their political interest to act like a Muslim. And so this phenomenon of hypocrisy becomes a very big deal. These are some of the differences that exist in the society of Medina as opposed to Mecca. In any case, One interesting thing again, we will probably come back to this, is that very soon after the Hijrah, the Muslims begin to conduct raids, military, uh, we can say raids on caravans of the Quraysh that are going to Syria. So in order for the Quraysh of Makkah to take business caravans and take goods to Syria, they have to pass by close to Medina. And so the Muslims begin to attack them. Every time the Muslims send out an expedition of forces, if the Prophet is with them, this is known as ghazwa. In Islamic history terminology, we would call that war, that military expedition, a ghazwa, if the Holy Prophet ﷺ is amongst that army. If the Prophet is not there, it's called a sariyah. Okay, so this is just a technical difference to keep in mind. Generally, a lot of these battles that we're familiar with, the Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Khandaq, they can be called ghazwa because it was like an expedition. Other than Khandaq, they were all battles that were fought outside the city of Medina. Even Khandaq, to a certain extent, was fought at, if the fighting that did happen, it happened at the edge of the city. And since the Prophet was there in that army that was sent out, it's called a khazwa. Anyways, the Muslims began to militarily show their strength. And they were looking to go and attack some of these caravans. When one of them, the caravan of Abu Sufyan, when it was returning from Syria and the Muslims were going to attack it, the Abu Sufyan and the kuffar of Quraysh had somehow got wind. The hypocrites or some people had told them that the Muslims were going to do this. So a huge army from Mecca comes to stop the Muslims. And this army is about 3 times bigger. It's very well equipped. It's present in this Meccan army are the chieftains, the Sanadid of the Quraysh, Abu Jahl, and a lot of these people, Abu Sufyan, of course, and all of the heads of the Quraysh are there. And the first battle happens, the first battle of Islam, the Battle of Badr. And the Muslims, with the help of Amir al-Mu'mineen, primarily with the help of angels that Allah sends down, that I mentioned in the Quran, the Muslims categorically win. They kill a huge number of the enemy. They take many captives. Despite their small number, they were an unbeatable force, and they rout the enemy. I think that's what you say, right? They rout the enemy. So that's the Battle of Badr. Uh, that happened in the second year after Hijrah. In the third year, the kuffar of Quraysh come to take revenge. They gather a larger army and they come to take revenge. But between the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud, that second battle is Uhud, an incident with one of the first Jewish communities in Medina transpires, where there is a kind of quarrel that happens between some Muslims and some Jews in the bazaar of Medina, and on both parties somebody is killed. Now, based on the constitution, based on the law, that could have been easily settled. There could have been blood money that could have been paid to both parties. The Jews could have paid the Muslims for the Muslim that was killed. The Muslims could have paid the Jews for the Jew that was killed. But the Bani Qaynuqa, they don't want that. They want to fight. And so they take refuge in their fortress. They think that, no, we have alliances with the hypocrites and with the Arabs and the other Jews. They're going to help us. We can muster an army that is much bigger than the Muslims and we can fight with them. But much to their surprise, nobody comes to help them. And they are surrounded by the Muslims. Their fortress is surrounded until eventually they surrender unconditionally. And when they surrender, they are all exiled. Okay, that was one incident that happened with the Bani Qaynuqa. The Battle of Uhud, again, I won't go into much detail. I think you guys are generally familiar with this. The kuffar come with a huge army to take revenge. The Prophet seeks the ideas from his community, from the Ummah. He does mashwara with the Muslims that what should we do? Should we fight in the city or should we go out of the city to meet them? Initially, some people wanted to fight in the city, but eventually the plan that's decided upon is that no, we're going to take an army out of Medina and we're going to meet this army that's coming to fight us. And so they go and they meet at Uhud. Although Hamza, the very brave, very important personality, the uncle of the Prophet, who was the same age as the Prophet, the paternal uncle, although he is slain and later his body is very, very shamelessly, horribly mutilated, despite that, the Muslims initially are winning very, very strongly. again, unstoppable Amir al-Mu'mineen and the other Muslims are killing a huge number of the enemy and causing them to flee. When some of the Muslims, so the Battle of Uhud was fought by a mountain, the mountain of Uhud. So Prophet had kept a group of Muslims to protect the rear of the army. Archers were kept, a group of about 50 archers were kept on the mountain a bit higher up to protect the back of the Muslim army. But when the Muslims are winning, these archers, despite the firm command of the Prophet that they should never leave their post, most of those archers run away and they want to join in the looting of the enemy army. And so the kuffar of Quraysh, Khalid bin Walid, and some of the chieftains of the army of the Quraysh, they see that and they take advantage. And they come around on their horses, they come around and they attack the Muslims from the back. And the Muslims now are all of a sudden somehow ambushed, somehow taken by surprise, and many of them are killed. They seek refuge in the mountain, and the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is injured at this point. The fighting is so close to the Prophet that he is hurt very badly. Eventually, the Muslims somehow take refuge in the mountain, and a rumor is spread that the Prophet has been killed. And so at that point, the Quraysh stopped the war, and the war kind of comes to an end, but it's not really clear who won now. Both parties suffered a very large number of casualties in this war. Okay, that's the Battle of Uhud. Again, the kuffar of the Quraysh, despite being, really thinking that they would be able to easily defeat these Muslims, they're seeing that whenever they try, they're being defeated, they're not able to. And so the Battle of Uhud it wasn't like they reached their goal, the kuffar of Quraysh, of wiping out Islam, killing the Prophet. And so again, they're firmly adamant that they're going to come back. And they're going to come back and uproot Islam for once and for all. They're really worried, they're really scared of the Muslims, of this new order that is coming out of Medina. And so the kuffar of the Quraysh, they begin to muster a huge army, many times the size of the army that they had taken before to Uhud or to Badr. They start to find Arab tribes throughout Arabia in the Najd, and they try to make alliances with Jews as well. So some of the Jews who work with them to come and fight are the same Bani Qaynuqa who are exiled, and another group called the Bani Nadir who are also exiled in this period from Medina. The reason why the Bani Nadir were exiled is that they tried to kill the Prophet. The Prophet had gone to their fortress to come and seek something from them, to ask a favor from them, and in that, when he was there in their midst, Jibreel comes to him and tells him that you must leave right away. They're planning to assassinate you. So when he leaves, then basically that is the cause of the Muslims to, surround the fortress of the Bani Nadir. These Jewish communities, despite living in Medina, they had their own quarters, they had their own fortresses. And so again, they are surrounded, and eventually they are forced to, they're told that you can take whatever wealth you want on your camels, the rest of it you have to leave. These were extremely wealthy, like based on the sources of history that I was looking at, these Jews were extremely rich people. The Muslims didn't even know how much money they had, but when they fled and when they went in exile, they took with them tons of jewelry and expensive cloth, and they decked out their camels with whatever they could, and they set out for Khaybar or for other places. So these two tribes of the Bani Qaynuqa and Bani Nadir were exiled in this period before the Battle of Khandaq. In the year 5 AH, the Battle of Khandaq transpires. So like I said, now a huge army, both of Arabs and Jews, has come to Medina to attack the Muslims, to wipe out Islam for once and for all. When the Prophet is told, according to some accounts, the uncle of the Prophet Abbas was living in Mecca and was one of these people who was sending messages to the Prophet, updating the Prophet. He was a spy for the Prophet, informing the Prophet what was happening. So the Prophet had his spies and he realized that this army was coming. He had like a week to prepare himself. So they didn't know what to do. This was an army that was way bigger than they had ever faced and was much larger than the forces they could muster that they had. And so basically the idea of Salman al-Farsi or Salman al-Muhammadi, this eminent Iranian companion of the Holy Prophet, his idea was to dig a trench in certain areas which were the areas that the enemy forces would come from, certain areas that were open. the kind of end of the city of Medina before the place that the army would come from, the Muslims built tirelessly in the span of a few days. They built this huge trench, this huge ditch. And when the army came, the Quraysh army was, taken by surprise. They had never seen this. This was not a military tactic that had ever been used in Arabia before, and there was nothing they could do. So again, for a long period, they camped outside the city of Medina. And at one point, we all know the story of Amr bin Abdwud. At one point, some of them were able to come over, and this very brave soldier from the enemy, Amr bin Abdwud, was killed by Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam. At that point, one of the things that happened was the final of the three Jewish tribes betrayed the Muslims. So they were like their fortress was one area that the enemy army could have used to come in, or it was somehow like a tactic that was used by the enemy to put pressure on the Muslims to divert forces that the Muslims had kept at the trenches to also have to worry about now this Jewish fortress. That was the last of the groups called the Bani Qurayza. And so after eventually there was also like very bad weather that by miracle there were like storms that Allah sent. And so the kuffar of Quraysh unable to enter the city of Medina, and with this weather, eventually they give up and they return back to Mecca or back to their homes. But now after the Battle of Khandaq, the treachery of this final Jewish tribe has to be dealt with. And so this is a very interesting, a very controversial episode in history is how the Muslims dealt with the Bani Qurayza. I'll very quickly mention what is said, and then we'll come back to it, inshallah. And this now brings me to an end of the kind of historical events. I want to now, in what remains in the next 15 minutes, I want to focus on some lessons that we can take out from this history. But very quickly, the common account that you can look yourselves for example, you can look at the book Muhammad of Martin Lings. It's a very, very beautifully written. I mentioned this, I think, 2 weeks ago. Very beautifully written in the sense that the English, Martin Lings was like a teacher of Shakespeare. He was a British non-Muslim who converted to Islam. His English is really, really eloquent, and he has an art of writing. He's written the seerah of the Prophet in like a very beautiful way that flows like a novel. Okay, the account there, which is like the commonly maybe narrated account, is that this Jewish tribe of the Bani Qurayza, maybe about 700 people, they were all massacred. They were basically told that, look, you have to surrender. And the Muslims knew that in the past, the enemies, such as the previous Jewish tribes that had surrendered, they continued to fight against Islam. They continued to be a cause of difficulty for the Muslims. They knew that on the one hand. And then basically, these people had betrayed Islam, and even according to their own Jewish law, the penalty of betraying and treachery in this way is that they should be massacred, they should be killed. Or another point is that they themselves agreed to the arbitration of one of their confederates, one of the Muslims who in the past had a close relationship with them from the Aus by the name of Sa'ad. The Bani Qurayza themselves agreed. They said, okay, Prophet of Allah, allow Sa'ad to decide what will happen to us, what our fate should be for betraying. And so Sa'ad then says that they must all be massacred. And according to the commonly accepted account, the Prophet agrees with that. However, just suffice it to say that this is controversial and not everybody has accepted this. There are many historians, Shia and Sunni, who do not accept this account. And they say that no, it did not happen in this way. And in fact, there is reason to believe that this account was fabricated to make the Aus look bad, that the hostility between the Aus and the Khazraj resulted in some of the Khazraj fabricating this account. They wanted to make it look like, look, the Prophet exiled those Jews that were that had a friendship with the Khazraj, but the Prophet killed the Jews that had a friendship and alliance with the Aus. So they had that reason to fabricate it. Or there's so many other questions that this story has that, like, for example, the people who have narrated it are not trustworthy, or in history, we never have any, the commonly accepted story is that the men were killed, but the women were allowed to remain captives in the Muslim community. The men were all, their bodies were thrown into this pit. But we never have, like, we don't know any accounts later on of people mentioning, okay, this is the pit where they were killed, or these were the women folk of their family that were living in Medina. There's a lot of question marks on this story, and just suffice it to say that many historians do not accept the story the way it is often narrated. For example, if you look in the account of Martin Lings, that account that you'll see there is not something that is accepted by everybody. Okay. Brother Kumail has a question. Was the decision rendered based on the agreement that was signed by the Bani Qurayza? I think that the agreements that were signed were an agreement of like not fighting one another, not betraying one another, agreeing to the arbitration of the Prophet. Okay, so there was this general acceptance that the Jews had to abide by certain laws, and then they betrayed this. And so, yeah, in a sense, you can say it was that they had agreed that the Prophet would arbitrate in problems. They had agreed that we would not betray. So when they did betray, um, this was the kind of punishment that they were given based on the opinion of Sa'ad. Again, all based on this account that is, the whole account is under question. Okay, so but yeah, the actual constitution or the actual agreement that the Muslims made with the Jews, I don't think it's had this like explicit thing that if you betray us, you're all going to be killed. No, this was just like an agreement that they would not betray. That's how I understood it. Is that clear, Brother Kumail? Okay. So the last point, inshallah, in these last 10 minutes is I just want to take out a few more lessons. Inshallah, this is not just like an account of history, but it's something which we are using to shape our worldview, take lessons from, learn from, benefit from. And so one of the things we can see overall in the Prophet's life, really outstanding quality that especially in these years of Makkah and the early years of Medina before the Muslim community had become very strong. Okay, so like by the Battle of Khaybar and by the conquest of Makkah that we'll talk about next week in our final session, by that time the Muslims were like in charge of Arabia. They had become extremely wealthy and extremely strong. But initially, the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Badr, the Muslims are still very weak. They're still very like in Arabia, they're not the main people, they're not the most powerful, most rich people. In fact, the Muslims lived in a lot of poverty in Medina. There was a group of Muslims known as Ahlus Suffa, I think, the people of the bench. They were like people who lived just beside the mosque in utter poverty. They didn't have any money. They had just moved to Medina to be close to the Prophet of Allah. And even the Prophet, Bibi Fatima, we all know the story of the tasbih of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, that she was in so much difficulty that she went to go ask the Prophet for help. And the Prophet taught her the tasbih that we read. That's so important for us to read after namaz. We have, by the way, we have in hadith that somebody who is very particular about doing the tasbih after namaz, Allah will ensure they never become a wretched person. This is the effect of doing the tasbih of Bibi Fatima alayhi salam. Anyways, one of the lessons we can take out of the Prophet's life when we look at this is the steadfastness that the Prophet had. That he had this vision, this goal that he was working towards, and he was full of energy. He never gave up. He inspired everybody on this path to work so tirelessly, despite all the odds, to go towards this goal that he was after. Let me, yeah, okay, let me just read one or two hadith in this regard. In one hadith, the Prophet says, Inna Allah yubkhid ashab al-farigh, that Allah detests a young man who is idle. You see, the Prophet inculcated and instilled this kind of a culture of working hard. Like Sayyid Kamil was saying in the beginning of today's session, using our time appropriately. We're not materialists who our only goal is to gain in this dunya. Okay, so whereas somebody who only believes in this dunya might be willing to work like 20 hours a day, no, we have other responsibilities. We have to take care of our family. We have to spend time worshiping Allah. But at the end of the day, we have to, that's all part of our bigger goal of serving Allah in the best way possible. And so we want to work hard in that path. In another hadith, Ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet, says that whenever the Prophet would look at somebody, look at a man that he was impressed with, let's say he saw a young person, very talented, very strong, he would say, هَلَّهُ حِرْفَةٌ. Does this person have a job? Does he have a profession? And if he was told, no, he doesn't. He's idle, he's jobless, he's not doing anything. The Prophet would say, Saqata min aini, that this person has fallen in my eyes. The Prophet was this, like this, that he wanted his people to work hard. Okay, so he had a lot of patience, a lot of perseverance, and he was working hard. Another beautiful point that, again, we don't have time to open these up, is that the Prophet was somebody who, and Islam overall, the path of the Ahlul Bayt, Amir al-Mu'mineen, they were people who were after a goal, but the ends never justified the means. They were only people who would act in a ethical way, in a principled way. So I'll give you one story and then I'll respond to a question that might come up here. One story in this regard to do with the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is that once the Prophet had had a son from one of his wives, I think Maria. His wife Maria had given birth to a son, yeah, Maria Qibtiyya, Ibrahim. And the Prophet loved this child a lot. At about the age of 18 months or so, the young child passed away. And the Prophet was very sad. He was crying. At that time, a solar eclipse happened in Medina. And the Muslims were all sure, they were like, this must have happened because the Prophet of Allah had his son passed away. And so you see here, anybody who wanted to take advantage of the situation, the Prophet could have just been quiet, taken advantage of the ignorance of his people to somehow further his goal. His goal is what? To somehow strengthen the Muslims' faith, strengthen their belief in him, make them more united around him. But he didn't accept that. I'm just looking at a book. I want to see how they explain. Yeah, basically, he came on the mimbar and he gave a talk and he said that this the solar eclipse that had happened has nothing to do with my son. This has its own kind of natural cause that has caused it. So basically, it's just one example. We all know stories of Amir al-Mu'mineen. For example, Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he became the Khalifa, people told him, leave Muawiyah in power. People who really loved him, who wanted the best for him, they told him, leave Muawiyah in power. Don't fight with him just yet. He's too strong. Establish your government and then later go fight for him. But Amir al-Mu'mineen would never do that. He never agreed to that. So these are examples of how Islam, the path of the Ahlul Bayt, it doesn't allow for us to engage in haram courses of action ever. We cannot do something that goes against the teachings of Islam to somehow try to attain a good goal. This is part of the ethics of the Prophet, part of the akhlaq of the Prophet, that in the long run, this was very beautiful for people. This was very, in the short term, it may seem to be something that's hard, but it hits at the fitrah of people, it attracts people, and it is a principled, ethical way of acting. Now, somebody might challenge this point that I just made and say, no, like we see examples of war. What about war? Like, what about the Prophet, like I just said, going to go raid the caravans of the Quraysh? Is this not an unethical act that he was doing to go and maybe strengthen his government? So he wanted the money, he wanted the goods of the Quraysh, so he would go and attack them. Or other such examples may be given as well that would be used to say that, look, we're allowing in the Sharia, you're allowed to lie under duress. You're allowed to say something false. That's something wrong. So the ends justify the means. We want to live, so we're allowed to lie to live, right? What could we say in response to that? I would love to hear from you guys, but because we're coming to an end of the class, I won't open it up. I'll just quickly say that no, in this situation, there's a fundamental difference. We're not saying that that action is something haram that we are allowed to do to reach a good goal. We are never allowed to do something haram, no matter what the goal is. Rather, what we are saying is that action is itself nothing haram. The Prophet was in a state of war. These were Alaikum. The computer all of a sudden went into like update mode. Can everybody hear me? My voice and picture coming through? Okay. Anyways, inshallah, I'll just wrap it up. The point that I was making there was just that these courses of action, for example, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Muslims attacking the caravans of the Quraysh, or that example I gave of lying under duress, these are not haram actions. They themselves are actions that are totally halal. For example, the kuffar of the Quraysh were at war with the Muslims, and so their wealth was not sacred and it could be taken. Or, for example, to lie is haram normally, but under duress, it's not even haram anymore to lie. Point was that. Inshallah, the last lesson of brotherhood is a bit important. Since our time is finished, inshallah, I'll take that up next week and we'll wrap up this discussion. I hope it has been useful for you, dear brothers and sisters. If there's any questions or comments, please feel free to right now ask or share the comment. Otherwise, inshallah, on the WhatsApp group, we will be in touch. Let's leave it at that. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.